research over the last 10 years that I've known and been involved with the Hizmet movement since 2004 has been to try and understand more about where this movement comes from, what it does, and in particular, why it's so controversial. And as you saw, Terry Spencer Hesser made this documentary largely for much of the same reasons, is to be able to try and allow people to get behind the headlines. One of the things that I discovered when I started doing this research is if you Google Fethullah Gülen, you get a whole bunch of just crazy stuff, and none of it makes any sense. It's all contradictory. So what's the real story? And the fact that there is all of this material which paints him in all of these different caricatures is in and of itself rather revealing about how he generates all kinds of stories and narratives that have basically nothing to do with him or with the movement, but do have to do with politics that are going on within the Islamic world internationally and within Turkey specifically, but also within our locales as well in the West. So it's really difficult to understand anything about Hizmet and Gülen and why it's controversial unless you know something about the context out of which this movement comes, because as we see in the film, it's not something that just showed up yesterday. It's been around for, you know, it's hard to pin an exact start date, but we'll just say the middle 70s. And since that time, over 1,000 schools have been founded internationally. There's something like 25 million people who have said that they have some connection to Gülen's writings. He's written over 30 books. That's not to say that there are 25 million followers. We don't know how many people are actually in the movement because it's not one thing. It's a whole bunch of civil society organizations, grassroots organizations that people just start on their own in different locations. People accuse Gülen of being some sort of puppeteer and a mastermind who from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in this compound, and I've been there to visit him. It's not a compound, it's a retreat center. But they accuse him of masterminding all of this kind of thing, and nothing could be farther from the truth. But when you look at this evolution of this movement, the only thing that, as a religious studies scholar, that I can compare it to are other historic movements that have changed the world that were both connected to religious visions and experiences and teachings and theological explanations along with personal piety and devotion and social justice and action. And that's people like Francis of Assisi and the Franciscan movement. It's people like Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits. It's people like John Wesley and the Methodists. So what I find really interesting about studying Gülen and the Hizmet movement is because I think we have an opportunity here in the 21st century to actually see another new movement of that scale and scope as the Jesuits or the Methodists or the Franciscans. Because I think when decades and centuries come back later and look back at this, you know, we will have seen this as the genesis of something pretty amazing. And it is transforming not only the Islamic world, but it's also transforming interfaith dialogue itself across many, many communities. So I think what I'm going to do is just go through, I think I'm already, we have this new clicker and we're trying it out. So I'm going to back up a bit. Basically what we have here, take the mic out, might be easier to see. That's fine, this is good. So to learn about this context of Hizmet in the Turkish history and politics, we basically have to realize that there's kind of two major dynamics going on, both what's happening domestically and what's happening internationally. And the domestic drivers are obviously, in terms of any form of democratization, whether it's Turkey or anywhere else, has to do with the military, media, big business, bureaucracy, judiciary, and the political system. And here we have to make a distinction that the government and the state are not the same thing, right? The government are those people who are elected to serve, but the state basically is what keeps things running from government to government. So sometimes the state can have enormous power and overshadow the power of the elected officials. And in Turkey's case, historically, the state had always been, since the founding of its time in the Republic in the 20s with Ataturk, the state had been largely controlled by these very militant, secular elitists who were, for a number of reasons, radically opposed to any presence of faith and civic religion. So in this you have civil society, groups that have arisen, different attitudes to try and fill the gap. You've got semi-state organizations, and then you have this collective consciousness that goes on in Turkey about where it's come from, particularly in the 20th century, very turbulent time. And then with respect to international dynamics, you have alliances, spheres of influence, agreements such as NATO, membership, prospects such as the possibility of the European Union, and then strategic resources. And it's hard to tell from this map, but if you take a look at Turkey on a globe, it's really quite amazing, because you just shift the globe around, and then you look at Turkey and you put Turkey at the center, and then what you see in your top left is Europe, and then what you see to your right is Asia, and then what you see to your bottom left is Africa, and what you see directly below is Saudi Arabia. So what you have is the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Europe, all basically surrounding Turkey. Turkey's a pivot point. Turkey itself, if you've ever had a chance to go, is an amazing place, because it really is this beautiful and complex and confusing, I mean, we all know where the word Byzantine comes from, right? And mysterious collection of what is both European and Middle Eastern at the same time. But Turkey also is a gateway to Africa. It's also a gateway to the Middle East. And you not only cross the Bosphorus to get to Asia or Europe, but you also, when you're in Turkey, you have access to many other places. So geopolitically, it's a very, very key place. It's now part of the G20. Economically, it's risen. Somewhere between 75 and 80 million people. All right, so in this domestic dynamics, where you have the military, and again, largely for most of the 20th century, it was a military dictatorship, even though it was technically a democracy, but we knew it didn't function as a democracy because the multi-party system really was there in name only. There really was only one major party for most of the 20th century, the CHP, the Republican People's Party, that had all of the power, and that it was itself dictated to by the military. And then big business, when we talk about big business, we're also talking about cronyism. We're talking about business that was pretty much state-owned business, or businesses that were in collusion with state actors. It wasn't, for most of the 20th century, it wasn't a free market capitalist approach. In fact, a great deal of that state ideology was Marxist. And then you have this thing called Kemalist ideology, and it was alluded to and talked about in the film, this ideology that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk had put together, and really helped to create this national narrative, this national myth. And it's somewhat understandable. You have to realize that at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and here you have Ataturk, well, not Ataturk at that time, he was Kemal. I mean, he gives himself the name Ataturk, right? And no one else is allowed to have that name. It literally means the father of the Turks. So Kemal is this war hero who helps to save Turkey from the British at Gallipoli, right? So he already begins to have this mythic status. But as he tries to protect the country politically, he sees that, here you have the Russians who are trying to take it on one hand, and then the French and the British on the other. So he wants to create a united front that will keep the Europeans and the Russians all out. And so there becomes this story of the Turks as a people that are kind of eternal and mythic and undivided. And that creates problems for the Kurdish minorities and other minorities. Because for most of the 20th century, under this Kemalist ideology, you couldn't even use the word Kurd. There were no such thing as Kurds. They were called Mountain Turks. They didn't have their own ethnic identity, and so for a great deal of that time, Kurdish language was not allowed in schools, and Kurdish published newspapers and televisions were prohibited. So this was a very ultra-nationalist ideology. It was very positive and materialist. It saw religion, again, as the enemy that had weakened Turkish society, therefore it was trying to expunge it. it was not neutral. So it was a secularism that was not modeled on Thomas Jefferson's understanding of secularism, but rather on a French Jacobin laicism. In other words, it saw religion as a threat. So secularism in the Turkish context basically means hostility to religion. It doesn't mean a neutrality. And that's important because you see that the state then controls all of the seminaries in which imams are trained in. There are no, what we call private seminaries, nothing that's independent. To be an imam growing up in the 20th century in Turkey, you have to go through these state-controlled educational centers, and your sermons have to be approved by basically what in effect would be the Department of Religion that state controls. Elitist and authoritarian. Again, if you are seen as a practicing Muslim, you cannot be promoted in the military. You cannot rise to the officer ranks. Many Turks know this from previous generations, that if you had aspirations to be a military officer, one of the tests that they would do for you in the military is that they would invite you to come, if you showed promise, then they would invite you to come and drink. And if you refused to drink, then basically your military career was over. So the Kemalists were terrified of two things. One, of disillusion of the state, of having it break apart. And so that's where this Kurdish national identity and the Kurdish threat of separation was such a huge problem for the Kemalists. And the other one was religious reactionaryism. They did not want religion to come back in, particularly Islamist kinds of politics. And so anytime there was a fear that democracy was actually taking hold and that the common people might actually have some input and lead to either of these two outcomes, the military would step in with its coups. And there were coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, and also 1997. And then you had these constitutional provisions that basically, gave undue power to the judicial branch to really pretty much make its own laws, and then the state controlled that. So again, here we have examples of what happened in 1960. So this is, Prime Minister Menderes, who very popular prime minister, but he was a threat to the military because he was so popular. So after 1960, and he was forced out, 2 years later, he was hanged. So we have 1971, the 1980 one with guns and tanks that rolled into the streets, and what's called the 1997 postmodern coup. This was a coup that didn't involve tanks and guns, but rather email. The military thought that the elected government had been too powerful, so they sent out an email saying, you will resign by the morning. And in effect, there was so much intimidation that pretty much happened. And then there was an attempted coup in 2003 that was foiled, and it was stopped by a chief of staff who found the plans for this and published it. And it's not surprising because in 2002 was a historic election of a brand new party, AKP, the AKP Party of Justice and Development, that at that time was basically going to work hard to bring this new democratization into effect. And what's happened in the last couple of years with AKP is also very, very important for us to take a look at too. And then another electronic e-coup that backfired in 2007. And this was also because information was leaked to the press before it actually was implemented. And then a judicial coup. So this was an attempt by the Supreme Court to basically outlaw the AKP, and it failed by one vote. So there was basically one vote away from making the AKP an illegal party, and therefore we would have had to force new elections. And then as recently as 2009, websites have been funded by taxpayer money, also attacking the elected government. So again, we're seeing the tension between the state and the government. All right, so these are some political trials. We won't go into a lot of the detail about that. It's important to note that there is this tension here and this connection, this network between the secular elite hardliners in the military, as well as those who run the state and those who run business and media. And for most of the 20th century, you could be a business leader who was basically either a retired military that came out of military, or you could be a military general that owned some of these state-run companies, such as automobile manufacturers or concrete or construction companies. And you could also own your own newspaper and television, which meant you could attack your business competitors as political enemies. So the standards of journalism are very, very different than what we would experience here in the West. The business attitudes. First generation businesses, again, middle of the 20th century, no attempts to really strengthen democracy. There was resistance to European Union membership, very protectionist policies, crony capitalism ruled the day. The second generation of businesses, so these are the businesses that started to arise, business people who arose in the 80s and the 90s, saw things differently. They wanted to be competitive. They wanted to be part of the EU. They wanted, as the documentary said, to have a piece of the pie. So this is this burgeoning middle class. But what's also interesting about this is that these are also believers. These are practicing Muslims who want to be part of the EU, who want to be part of the global market. These are not the secular elitists, because these are folks in the middle class who've been shut out by the secular elitists. And now the third generation of businesses, which are global businesses. And then the Turkish media, all kinds of problems. Again, the links between basically CEOs or bosses or owners who can own the media, they can own banks, businesses, and they can also be very much tied into the state. Here's some examples of how media bosses use their media basically to attack their business competitors and political opponents. A headline here that it says, "If necessary, we will use weapons." So again, threatening military intervention. The fear of coup is always ever present within Turkish identity and history. And then civil society. At a certain point in the 1990s, it became clear that, and Hizmet was one of these civil society groups, that Turkey just can't continue having coup after coup every 10 years. It's an unstable situation, and it works against outside investment. So there was pressure to try and have greater transparency, and the European Union candidacy helped with that, because the benchmarks for entering into the European Union required greater judicial balance, greater checks and balances between executive branches and judicial and legislative, as well as greater checks on military power, as well as greater standards for trade and business control and media and journalism. So then you begin to have this kind of pro-democracy coalition which emerges, made of liberal Democrats who are intellectuals and journalists, observant Muslims, Christians and Jews, Kurdish citizens, basically any minority group there, some of the Turkish left, and anyone who's been a victim and suffered under these coups. So this is where Hizmet arises. And it's a pro-democracy civil society movement, largely made up of observant Muslims who are very inspired by Gülen's teachings and by Gülen's call to community service. And they see themselves as the movement of humans gathered around high human values, which is quite a mouthful. So you can see why Hizmet became more of a common term. Hizmet is Turkish for service. But Gülen himself said, well, if you ask what we're about, what we do is we try to promote high human values. Gülen saw humanism as the goal of the movement, not a secular antithetical humanism to religion, but rather humanism that's born out of religion. So for Gülen, just like religion and science were not enemies, and just like religion and democracy are not enemies, also for Gülen, religion and humanism are not enemies. That religion can actually be one of the motivating factors for promoting humanistic values. And then again, Gülen saying there's no return from democracy. And he provides a theological argument for why democracy is important. Because governance by the people is against governance by a domineering person or group. It's not against governance by God. So basically, for those who would say, well, but Gülen, you can't have democracy because God is the ruler, and democracy is people, exerting their will against God. Gülen said, no, democracy is people exerting their will against tyrants. God rules above everything, but we're responsible for what's happening here in the world, down here on earth. So the contributions to education, again, equal opportunity. The powerful example we saw in the film about how the Gülen's educational efforts are transforming girls' education. The increased participation of underrepresented groups, the focus on pro-democracy and pro-European Union membership, the formation of the Journalists and Writers Foundation. In 2010, I went to the Avant meeting, and the theme that summer had to do with the Kurdish question, and there was a lot of free discussion about how to improve the situation for Kurdish communities. And then the rise of this, what was called Ergenekon, which was this kind of deep state that was in place to try and protect against any Islamic takeover. And this was nothing new, but this goes back to the founding of Turkey in the 20s and the 30s, but especially the establishment of Turkey when it joined NATO in the late 1940s. And here's just information from the Open Source Center about the history of Ergenekon. The elected government of Turkey. Okay, and this gets us more into the current situation in the last couple of years. When legislation is passed that's polarizing, or when there's corruption or mismanagement, then the elected government gets into trouble. One example in mid-1990s was the Welfare Party. But we're going to come back to that in just a minute. At the end of World War II, you also had the Soviet threat in the multi-party system. So this allowed Turkey, basically, the West was begging Turkey to be part of NATO, but they put a condition on it. You cannot join NATO if you're a single-party system. When Turkey had been founded, the Republicans People's Party, the CHP, was really the only party. So they had to have these kind of nominal party opposition parties, but they really had no teeth, they really had no power. And then again, the Copenhagen criteria, greater transparency, greater accountability, all of this is good because it helps to strengthen the democratic practices and processes within Turkish society and Turkish politics. And then the question, where will Turkey be in this column with other emerging Islamic nations, in the midst of, or in the wake of the Arab Spring of 2011, particularly with all of these things that make up a democratic society. But, and here's the big but, things started to change a couple of years ago, particularly within the AKP, and particularly within the leadership of Erdogan. And this is once again where Hizmet finds itself on the receiving end of criticism. So back in the 80s and the 90s, Hizmet was criticized because, again, it was seen as this kind of shadow Islamist party that was going to try and take things over. At that point, this was the Kemalist secular elitists, the CHP, who were making these accusations. Once AKP took power in 2002, it looked like now Hizmet was going to basically finally have a period of a lack of persecution from the Turkish state, because now the elected government could begin to enact some reforms and some changes, and particularly with the constitutional reforms of 2010, things were looking good. However, it became clear that Erdogan himself, the former mayor of Istanbul, and who was really the creator of the AKP, and for so many years, for 10 years, had done such a great job of moving Turkey forward in democratization, began to retreat from that. He began to say, well, maybe entering into the European Union is not really what we want to do after all. He also began to be very upset about international criticism. And it turned out he has a very kind of thin skin when it comes to criticism. And all of you remember what happened with the protests in Gaza. So he completely overreacted with some of that, and using tear gas and water cannons and everything like that, all because people in his previous city that he was the mayor of were protesting about the building of the shopping center. And he took it very personally. Basically, how dare you question my judgment on this? So it became clear that he had a very paternalistic attitude. Well, in so doing, the folks who criticized his oversteps the loudest were some of the Hizmet folks, because they said, look, we've helped you, we've supported you for these last 10 years, but what you're doing to the people now is wrong. You're hurting the people, you're not helping them anymore. And then there began to be more and more instances of corruption, particularly corruption having to do with what the elected AKP government of Erdogan was doing with the Iranians. There were sanctions against the Iranians over their nuclear program, but Turkey was giving the back door to be able to export oil through Turkey in exchange for gold. And that gold, coincidentally, kept showing up in the family members of Erdogan himself. And so once this became known, and once members of his voting bloc, including Hizmet folks, started pointing out, saying, look, this is not being managed well, and it really looks like there's corruption going on, he felt like Hizmet had turned against him, because now they were raising these questions and they were criticizing him. But of course, these are valid criticisms. And Hizmet was doing its duty, basically, to be good citizens, and Erdogan basically then turned on Hizmet, turned on Gülen, found another scapegoat. And for Erdogan, it was very convenient then to paint Hizmet and Gülen as another enemy again, because it took, and of course he has all of the media to do it, because Erdogan himself is in control of 7 newspapers and 24 television stations. He can basically create a single narrative against this movement and paint it in the worst possible light, partly as a way of distracting from any legitimate investigations that would be done around some of these questions of corruption. So, the summary here: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In the United States, we've learned our lesson about term limits. You can have some very promising presidents like Nixon or Clinton who really, go sour at the end. So it's very important that they don't stay there too long. And this has created a lot of sadness, a lot of heartache for members of the Hizmet movement who had faith in Erdogan in 2002 and put a lot of hopes in him and saw him accomplish some very, very good things for the Turkish people. And then really since the winter of 2012, see all of that begin to unravel. So the 2010 constitutional amendment now puts some civilian controls over the military for the first time. For the first time in Turkey's history as a republic, military officers who commit crimes now can be tried in civilian courts. Prior to that, it couldn't happen. A year later, in June 2011, there were elections that gave a clear majority to AKP. And then after that, Erdogan saw that as a mandate, to basically, that he saw himself as the great leader that Turkey had been longing for ever since the demise of Ataturk. I think it might even go deeper than that. My take on this is that Erdogan, in his paternalistic view of himself, not only sees himself as the person who's trying to save Islam in Turkey from Muslims, who feel don't actually have enough responsibility to do it for themselves. He's trying to save Turkey from the Turks. He's basically trying to make the decisions for everyone. He doesn't really have faith in democracy. And he wants to see himself bringing back a kind of Ottoman-style sultanate. So I think in some ways, it's not so much that Erdogan wants to be the next Ataturk. I think Erdogan actually wants to be the next Suleiman. So in 2002, 2007, 2011, you have these campaign promises that were made for a democratic civilian drafted constitution that stopped profiling citizens, civil servants, and business, and to end public corruption. So these are the campaign promises. However, after this third term election, or after this third election, beginning of the third term, now just the opposite begins to happen. The profiling continues, in fact, increases. Public corruption reaches unprecedented levels. And now people are, and the judiciary is given powers again. The checks and balances are erased. And then starting really last December, the blaming of enemies to cover up this corruption. The checks and balances are being eliminated, and the executive branch is getting stronger and stronger. And this is how they win elections. The unfair campaign financing, again, the ruling party. Contracts go to favored businesses who then contribute to the campaign financing, influence the votes. And many Turks will be asked about this, and they'll say, look, I don't like Erdogan anymore, but I voted for him anyway. And they say, well, why? I mean, why did you vote for him? You know he's corrupt. And they say, well, yeah, he is corrupt, but 30 years ago, the government used to take 80% of the money and give us only 20%. Well, Erdogan takes 20% and gives us 80%. It's still not legal, it's still not ethical, but at least it's better. So there's a kind of a shrug, and I think what folks, they become so disillusioned that they're really eager and longing for some kind of honest politics and return that could come back down to remove this. So here we have concerns that now Turkey is also burning its bridges internationally. Its relationship with Europe is pretty much over right now. It's dead. The candidacy to the European Union is completely stalled. Because of Erdogan's support of ISIS, or tacit support of ISIS as a way to overthrow Assad, Turkey's relationship with the United States is at an all-time low right now as well. And people have made, comparisons to Erdogan and Putin in terms of, trying to keep this extended leadership going forever and to consolidate power, and to circumscribe human rights and eradicate judicial independence and put the judiciary within, basically under the direction of the executive branch. The consolidation of media, the rise of ultra-nationalist rhetoric. We begin to see dimensions of authoritarianism coming back in again. Hate speech, particularly directed at Gülen, particularly directed at Hizmet, and all of this. The tutoring centers being closed down. Most recently, Kimse-Yok-Mu, the parliament under influence of the executive branch passed a law that now prohibits Kimse-Yok-Mu from being able to fundraise without getting local permission from local governments, and which is basically going to kill Kimse-Yok-Mu's fundraising apparatus for right now, because prior it had been able to fundraise all throughout Turkey and internationally, and right now it's almost going to make it impossible legally for it to operate. Going after some of these banks that had connections, and again, these banks were banks that helped to create the rise of the Turkish middle class, because these were banks that brought more fair lending practices and made capital available to this rising middle class of business people, this second and third generation of business people who weren't part of that secular elite that had been shut out for 70 years in the 20th century. And now these banks are under investigation and under pressure to be shut down, like Asya. And what's happening here is basically the Turkish economy is starting to tank. Because the government is no longer seen as trustworthy, many outside foreign investment is starting to chill and starting to pull out. And so this is going to be very, very bad. Over the next year, things are going to be really, really, Turkey's at a turning point, at a crucial crossroads, and what will happen in Turkey over the next year will be very, very important to watch, because it can't continue along this road. Economically, it's taking a nosedive, and whether or not Erdogan will be deposed through violence or through hopefully some sort of democratic mechanism is yet to be seen. But in the meantime, Hizmet's going to continue to be the pawn that gets blamed for everything that's going wrong. So these are some of the historic steps that have happened within the last 10 years in this direction towards re-authoritarianism. And then again, part of the reason why Hizmet was targeted, because it doesn't have alliances, right? It's not a political party. It stands out from the political, it's a civil society movement. So when it sees things that are wrong, and it doesn't matter whether it's AKP or CHP or whatever, it's going to raise its voice, it's going to criticize. That's the role, that's what the role of any good citizen or organization, civil society organization should be doing. Because it won't play along with the corruption it's being targeted. Is this a political power struggle? AKP is trying to justify its actions, but the Hizmet has never tried to promote politics. In fact, the movement, Gülen had instructed the movement not, during the protest in Ghazi, not to go down and protest, for fear that if they were protesting, they would be seen to be political. So they even bend over backwards not to exert any kind of organized political power. Again, Hizmet subscribes to the idea of civil cultural Islam, not political Islam. And it could have, I mean, this is the thing. Hizmet is so prevalent in Turkish society, and this is why the elected government in a sense fears it, is it could have taken over AKP if that's what Hizmet wanted to do, but it's not. Hizmet wants to serve the society. It only has 2 members of parliament. So that's pretty much it. We're going to wrap it up there.